Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. Coming up on today's show, we'll learn how testing your hay can give your cattle an edge on nutrition and potentially save you money. Plus, we'll be joined by Kyle Bumsted to discuss the grain and livestock market. We'll get to those stories coming up here in a moment, but first. Millions of cattle are currently being transported across the United States as this year's fall run continues. This can be a stressful time, though, for cattle, and it's important that producers and haulers do what they can to limit the stress on those animals. There are three major stressors in cattle's lives throughout their production cycle. Those are birth, weaning, and transportation. If improperly transported, you can see a negative impact on the performance of cattle as a result of stress. Research has shown that shipping-related stress can have a noticeable impact on immunity and prolong the amount of time that calves are off feed following a shipping.
The reason transportation is so stressful is because we're taking an animal from an environment they were raised in or comfortable in and sending them to a new environment. So they're experiencing many new changes, and so that's what makes it so stressful on them. Also, when they're on a trailer, they got to maintain balance or hold themselves on the trailer, and so that expends a lot of energy for them when they do that. And so, again, that can also increase stress as well. A past beef quality assurance survey showed when we were looking at Texas and Nebraska feed yards that feeder cattle coming into the feed yards in those states were traveling almost 500 miles and a little over 500 miles in some instances. And so we know that cattle are on trailers for a long period of time. And so because of that, we need to make sure that we are following simple, basic guidelines and best management practices to ensure that these animals, the amount of stress that are exhibited to these animals is very little.
Before cattle are shipped, the first thing haulers should do is check the cattle over for any signs that they might not be fit for transportation. This includes checking the overall health of the animal, the mobility score of the animal, and the animal's body condition score.
When it comes to the health status of the animal, that's a big biosecurity risk, right? So we don't want to be sending animals that are sick that might jeopardize other cattle. When it comes to mobility scoring, the mobility score is broken down into 4 different categories. 1s and 2s mobility scores, those animals are fit for transport, load them on the trailer, send them down the road. So a mobility score of 1 is totally normal, the animal walks normal, moves out normal, and there's nothing we need to worry about. When we see a mobility score of 2, that is when we might see a slight limp or a little bit of stiffness in their stride. That's not really a major concern. The real thing that we're looking at is if they can stay caught up with their herd mates as we move them from the pens. It's when we get to our mobility score of 3 where we need to take some extra precautions. So mobility score of 3 is when we have an obvious limp, obvious stiffness, and so one real key indicator of that is when we move cattle out as a pen, we see one animal fall to the back and they can't stay caught up with their herd mates. That automatically makes them a mobility score of 3. Now, we can transport mobility score of 3 animals, but we need to do it with special provisions. What we mean by that is that animal needs to be the last one on the trailer, that way they can be the first one off. A mobility score of 4, those animals exhibit extreme stiffness. They don't really want to move. Even when they're encouraged by a handler to move out, they kind of just want to stand there because either their foot hurts or their leg hurts, something like that, that's really affecting their mobility. Those animals do not need to be transported. We do not transport those animals under BQA guidelines because if that animal goes down the trailer, the likelihood for them to recover is not very great. When it comes to body condition score, the BQA guidelines set forth says that we should not be transporting cattle that are a body condition score of 2 or less. So many producers understand the body condition score for beef cattle is a 1 to 9 scale, with our target being a 5 or 6. So if we're being asked under BQA guidelines not to transport cattle that are a 2 or less, that gives us 3 body condition scores to make up our mind, like, okay, this animal is not able to retain weight. We need to make sure we market them as quickly as possible so that they can get on further down the production cycle, possibly on down to the harvest side of it, Or we retain those animals, we hold them back, try to put a little extra feed or groceries to them in order for them to get their body weight back up to a good level before we transport them.
We'll have more BQA tips from Jesse coming up next week. But if you'd like to learn more about beef quality assurance guidelines and practices in the meantime, you can find all that you'd like to learn online at the website beefwatch.unl.edu. We'll also include a helpful link along with this story. You can find them on the Market Journal website. Well, happening this weekend in Indianapolis is the 95th National FFA Convention. Each year, more than 60,000 FFA members come together to attend sessions, compete in national competitions, and network with members from across the country. In honor of that convention taking place, we wanted to showcase an outstanding FFA member right here in Nebraska. Carson Ryman is a member of the Gothenburg FFA chapter. Now, each FFA member across the country is required to have a supervised agricultural experience, or SAE project for short. Carson's SAE is called Ryman Spuds.
Ryman Spuds is my FFA project, my SAE. And basically, it's a half acre of potatoes planted on land that I rented from a local farmer. And all this summer, I've cared for, watered, and weeded them so I could bring them to you guys.
Ryman said his family has always had a big garden with potatoes, so he decided to upscale the spud portion to make a business.
Me and my dad have planted potatoes for several years in the past. We've always had a really big garden. Nothing crazy big, but we've planted a lot of potatoes in the past. And something that I've learned from that, and that made me aware of a lot of the challenges that I could face with upscaling this to something like a half acre. So this is what really made me comfortable with the potatoes and kind of got me into the idea of selling and making a profit off of them.
For those not familiar with the potato growing process,
so you want to plant sometime in between April and May. You'll plant them in the ground. You'll cover the potatoes up just like you do with about any other seed. And then basically you wait for about 2-ish months, and then you can do this thing called hilling potatoes. It's kind of where you kick more dirt right on top of them so that they can grow and produce more potatoes. Then it's just the usual. You keep watering, keep weeding, and eventually, come August, September, you'll have a bunch of potatoes.
Since this is his first year running Ryman Spuds, he said one of his main goals is to learn more about the industry.
So one of my main goals for this first year has been to really become profitable within my first year. And I tried not to keep my expenses too high, but there are some stuff you really need to start potato business. And at the end of this first year, I've learned a lot about what different varieties I want to incorporate next year. Some varieties I want to cut. There are some varieties that I really want to add. And it really made me a lot more familiar with a lot of the watering processes, and the harvesting process is just getting started right now. It'll make me, for next year, a lot more prepared when this all comes around.
Ryman said he hopes his SAE project will encourage other FFA members to pursue entrepreneurship.
So one of my main long-term goals is really to have a lasting effect on the community, because it's a community project. I mean, everybody can benefit from it, and it's one of those things that can really withhold in Gothenburg and stay there for future FFA chapters. And something that I really want to do is try and be able to inspire a lot more of any young entrepreneurial FFA kids to try and start their own business.
Potatoes from Ryman Spuds are currently found in area grocery stores and at pop-up stands. A neat project by a young FFA member there in Gothenburg. He's got a bright future ahead of him. Shifting our focus over to the markets now, this week we were joined by a new face for Market Journal. That is Kyle Bumsted. He's a market analyst who calls Ericson, Nebraska home. His expertise is in the cattle and the grain markets. We began the conversation with Kyle on Wednesday afternoon by learning more about his background.
Well, I'm Kyle Bumsted. I'm a registered commodity broker, and my family and I farm with my wife's family here west of Ericson, between Ericson and Burwell, north of Ord, and we have a couple kids and raise cows, cow-calf, and feed yard and row crops. So also a commodity office here at the place too.
Well, I'm excited to have you join us this week on Market Journal. Let's attack the grain side of things, and then we'll get to the cattle markets in a second, Kyle. When it comes to the grain markets, give me your general take there. What are you seeing?
So far in the corn market, I guess we'll lead off there. It looks to be pretty friendly. We've got inverted markets here east of July, and the basis keeps firming as we get deeper into harvest. Harvest is really getting wrapped up out there, And the national cash basis is actually firming. So that tells us that the end users, whether it's processors, elevators, feed yards, are really looking for corn. Now, was looking at history a year ago, where our basis was versus this year. We're 20 cents better on a national cash basis index than we were a year ago at this time. So that tells me that our stocks to use is even tighter this year as we're in the middle of harvest or wrapping up harvest than we were a year ago at this time.
Well, here kind of on the topic of corn, I want to get to a viewer question we had this week, Kyle. Had a viewer ask us to see if you would give your thoughts. Is $6 to $7 corn here to stay at least for a while? Your thoughts on that?
I think it is short term. It's here to stay for a while. Corn likes round numbers, and depending on which side of the first of the year you're looking at, I'm sure you probably got some corn stored or looking at that after the first of the year. But it seems like for the Dees contract, we're staying between $6.60 and $7. It likes those round numbers, more in tune lately with the $6.80 to $7 mark. But looking out there further, what the market's telling us is December trading a penny and a half over July futures right now. It's an inverted market, and that is structurally friendly long term, meaning our fundamentals are tight, meaning we either have a smaller crop or we've got really good demand. So it does appear that we could stay here north of the $6 mark for quite some time. Now, I would look for that potentially to change here as we move into later first quarter, maybe start of second quarter, as we get a little bit better handle on the livestock side of things.
Kyle, we'll hit on the livestock here in a second, but besides corn in the grain complex, anything when it comes to wheat or soybeans catching your attention there?
Yes, Kansas City wheat is. Kansas City wheat, that market there is probably the most fundamentally bullish right now as we go home here this week. We've got inverted spreads out there. December trading over March by a half cent, March over the July by about 9 cents, and July over September new crop July versus September next year, penny and 3/4 inverted. So that's telling us that we had a small crop last year, or 2022 was our small crop here. The old crop wheat was small, but then also we've had a big demand pull from the northern plains as merchandisers have come down here looking for higher protein wheat to blend off with on the spring wheat side of things. But getting back to the Kansas City wheat here, we need to keep an eye on that drought monitor. We just keep missing rains here in the western plains. The western Kansas corridor and the Oklahoma panhandle and Texas panhandle just seems to keep missing rain. And we've got a lot of wheat dusted in the ground, and the old adage is plant in the dust, your Benz will bust. But that wasn't the case this past year, as we were in dry conditions too when we dusted the wheat crop in here that we took out here in 2022. So the Kansas City wheat market, I think, is going to be sideways here for a little while, because most of the commercials and non-commercials have kind of taken their money off the table for a while here, and I think they'll come back in this spring. But we really need to keep an eye on that moisture map here moving through winter.
Well, let's shift over to the cattle markets now. I look back on 2022, and starting the year, the conversation was all about how the leverage is going to shift from the packers to the cattlemen. At this point, 10 months into the year, do you think we fully absorbed that at this point?
I don't think we've fully absorbed out of it, but we have come a long ways. And when we've come a long ways, the last month or so, we have come a really long ways here as far as the fundamental structure of this live cattle market. And it took the cash to really get this thing going. But once we saw the spreads turn as well too, and I like watching those forward spreads, because it tells me if they're bidding for cattle up front here, then the front months are going to be leading this complex. Whereas they've been pushing that premium out there in the deferred, saying, we've got plenty of cattle, let's just kind of hold them back here, we don't need to bid up. But then here about 2 weeks ago, the cash market really came alive, and that's when our spreads started to really wake up and start to move too. Now, during the month of September, when we just got out of this cattle and feed report here that we had here last week, the month of September, we saw some of those spreads really start to tighten in. And we've gone from historically bearish territory, which we're still in bearish territory on these spreads historically, but we are a lot less bearish than we were a month ago on these cattle. Now, case in point here, as we're moving through the month of October, we're getting set to wrap that up, and we've seen some of the spreads that I'll be watching for next summer marketings as far as placements going in here in the month of October. Those have tightened as well too. So that tells me that we could start to see a friendlier cattle on feed situation set up here, and kind of shrinking those numbers as we get into the end of the first quarter of next year. We could start to see that happen. However, it's going to depend on how big these cattle come in. We've placed a lot of light cattle, and it's going to depend on too how fast the packer wants to move through them. Here recently, we've moved through a lot of cattle, and we've processed a lot of cattle, and the slaughter numbers have been big, and we've also been able to hold it together on the demand side so far.
All right, something to watch for sure. Kyle, just final thoughts here. Anything else you want to leave us with, whether it be final thoughts or risk management advice in the grain complex or in the livestock side of things?
Sure. You know, we're wrapping up 2022 very rapidly. And we've had all these talks and the Fed's raising interest rates and things like that. So I think now is a good time as we're sitting there, finishing up in the combine or get done working cattle here. Maybe now is the time to sit down and look through things and see what we can plan and kind of control what we can control as far as, moving things around the first of the year and having those discussions with our lenders and things like that about interest and some of those costs that could start to get out of control if we don't watch them.
Kyle, we appreciate your time right here on Market Journal.
You bet. Thank you.
Some interesting thoughts and perspectives there from Kyle. We appreciate him joining us on the program for the first time. Now, coming up next week, we'll be joined by Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners. Be sure to email us with questions for Jeff, and we'll include those in next week's broadcast. Moving on now, there are buffer zones to our rivers, streams, and waterways that are often featuring trees, shrubs, grass, and native plants. These buffers have gained considerable attention in recent years, partly because they've been disappearing from our rural landscape, and partly because of their great importance that they hold for protecting our water quality, preserving topsoil, and providing food and shelter for wildlife. You can learn more about the importance of these buffers in the October issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is now time for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, as harvest starts to wind down, row crop producers are eyeing fall fieldwork. Many, though, need some rain first. How are things looking as we turn to the week ahead?
Well, Bryce, we certainly did see a little bit of precipitation over this last week, particularly in northeast Nebraska. Thursday when we seen that system move through the state. Outside of that area, not much in the way of major moisture. And of course, the other one was Sunday, following the cold front in southeast Nebraska after we've seen some significant fire activity, unfortunately, in southern Lancaster County. So as we go through this next 7-day period, really the precipitation opportunities are just not there. We are looking at a major system coming in for next weekend, but until then, it looks like it's going to be a fairly dry pattern. So let's take a look at the way things are going to set up. And first thing I want to show you is the official winter forecast. We're going to go through this real quick. CPC's put this out here last week. This is basically what they're thinking: cold to our north, warm to our south, and in terms of precipitation, wet on the west coast, the Great Lakes, and dry across the southern plains. So let's take a look at what's actually going on. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is we have this upper air low that split off from a piece of energy coming out of the Central Rockies, kind of responsible for some of the precipitation we've seen on Thursday. This low is expected to move up toward the northeast and bypass us, so we're going to remain pretty much high and dry. As we go into tomorrow, basically this low opens up and heads toward the Ohio River Valley. We're left between the northern jet stream and the southern jet stream, so a pretty benign pattern. Temperatures are going to be pretty much around normal in the lower to mid 60s. And as we go into Monday, this trough lifts off and we start to see ridging temporarily starting to build into our region, which brings us a little bit warmer conditions, and that will only intensify as this trough moves down the western seaboard. So by the time we get to Tuesday, you can see this trough digging into the western United States. Warm air rises up, so we should be in the 70s across a lot of the state, and probably the mid 70s to some portions of southwestern Nebraska. By the time we get into Wednesday, that piece of energy across southern Texas moves toward the southeast, and this storm really digs down the west coast, and that's going to bring some windier conditions to the plains regions, which will only intensify as we get closer to the weekend. And we look at Thursday, this low starts to make its way inroads into the southwest, keeps our winds from the south-southwest at the surface. So we're going to have a higher fire danger, and we're going to be dealing with those high winds once again. And by the time we get into Friday, GFS wants to string this low pressure system out, so there is some differences in the models whether or not this is going to progress toward the east or whether it's going to lift toward the north and east, and that makes a big bearing on who's going to get the precipitation. So we'll watch out as we get to the end of next week, because there is some signals that we will see some precipitation across Nebraska. It's just not where it's going to happen and the intensity of it, but it does look like a fairly decent opportunity for that moisture. If we look even farther out from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, the warm air pushes toward the east as that cold air with that upper air trough kind of moves in the western United States and builds toward the east. And in terms of precipitation, with that system ejecting out, wide expansive area of precipitation, the bigger question is who gets the majority of this moisture, but at least there is a shot as we go into next weekend for some decent moisture across the state.
Thank you for that update, Al. Well, when it comes to feeding cattle, it's important to remember that not all hay is created equal. Total digestible nutrients and crude protein levels often vary. That could mean the difference between a heifer losing a quarter pound per day or gaining nearly a third of a pound per day. The bottom line is, if you know the quality of your hay, you can make better decisions in terms of necessary supplementation. Market Journal's Bill Dodd recently caught up with an extension beef systems specialist to learn why testing your hay can be good for your cattle and your bank account.
With hay in tight supply this year, it would be a good idea to test any hay you're planning on feeding your herd in order to ensure you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. Testing hay can help ensure that a producer's cattle are getting the nutrition they need while simultaneously helping avoid any additional costs due to overfeeding.
When we talk about testing hay, really what we're talking about is getting a sample of the hay and submitting it to a lab to get it analyzed to determine the nutrient content. In particular, we're really interested in the protein content, the energy content, and then also phosphorus. If we think about our current situation, if you're short on hay, we may also want to be able to limit how much hay we're actually feeding, and maybe that might be that you can limit feed and still be meeting needs of your cow herd because the hay quality is really good. And this year I would expect that with the lower precipitation, you might actually have some higher quality hay than in previous years. Or you might decide that I want to stretch my hay a little bit. I'm going to limit how much I feed and actually feed some more supplement, for instance. But all of that hinges on actually knowing the nutritional value of that hay to make sure that you actually can meet needs, whether it be by free feeding hay or limit feeding hay.
While testing your hay does add some cost and labor to your overall operation, the potential savings you could incur from the process far outweigh any of the associated costs with the testing process.
Hay testing is not very expensive, especially for common types of hay. You can get an NIR test, which costs maybe $20 for a sample. And if you think about your hay and you think about the amount of supplement you might need to feed, let's say brome grass hay, very common hay that is in eastern Nebraska anyways. From one year to the next, the feed values can vary tremendously. So we can have something that's maybe going down to even like a 48 to 50 TDN up to all the way to maybe even a 58 TDN. Well, that can be the difference between meeting a developing heifer's needs or needing to supplement her 3 or 4 pounds of distillers to actually meet her needs. So on average, the variation in the nutritive content, protein and energy in hay can really result in the amount that you may need to be feeding in terms of supplement, $20 to $40 per head over the winter. So spending $20 to get a hay test versus changing how much supplement you need to change from $20 to $40 per head, easy payback, right? So one of the things we suggest is actually using a hay core sampler. Most of our extension offices have one you can borrow. You can hook them up to a drill. They really can. If they're good and sharp, they can really help you to be able to get a nice representative sample because it goes through multiple layers in the bale, and you sample multiple bales, and you're going to send off just one sample that represents your whole versus actually taking a grab sample and representing 1 square foot, right? The labs are pretty doggone good at their job, right? They do a good job of analysis, but they're only as good as the sample that they get in.
When sampling your hay, the best practice is to sample by lot. This means if you're sampling from hay obtained over multiple fields with varying soil types and conditions, or if the hay was cut down at different times, you should be testing those as separate lots and not all together. This can give you an advantage when it comes to planning when you would like to feed your cattle hay with higher or lower nutritional values.
Those should be sampled separately. So if you have different fields, different even weed pressures in some fields, you want to make sure you're keeping those bales separate from other bales and actually sampling them separately so you get a better idea of the hay quality that you have, and also allows you to do a little bit more strategic planning. Right? The really high quality stuff you might say for your younger, for your heifers, or maybe for your younger cows, and the lower quality might be what you're using to get, some of your more mature, older cows through the winter because it may be closer to their nutritional needs. And Nebraska Extension, our educators and our specialists can always help you once you have the hay test to plan out what you're going to feed to which groups and make a plan for how much supplementation you need. So you don't have to go it alone. You don't have to understand all of the analysis that you get back, but you're giving us more information and new tools to be able to best help you. Otherwise, we're making guesses, and our guesses might be wrong, and those guesses might be costly, right? Because either we do what I would say most of us end up doing, is being a little bit conservative and saying, well, we're going to guess it's a little bit lower quality and make sure we meet needs, and that may be requiring you to feed a little bit more than is actually needed.
When it comes to ensuring your cattle are getting the best nutrition they can over the coming cold months, taking action now and testing your hay could prove very beneficial for your herd and your bank account. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks for that story, Bill. Mary also tells us when you're sending in your hay samples, you want to make sure that you're properly labeling those samples by identifying the type of hay being sent in for testing. If you'd like more information on testing hay and how it could save you some cash this year, we've added a link to Mary's Beef Watch article on this topic. Finally today, this past week was a challenging one for first responders statewide. It started many months ago as a lack of rainfall has caused drought conditions across Nebraska. Add to that a windy day with gusts this past Sunday reaching 50 miles per hour. A red flag warning was issued and what many had feared came true. Fires began being reported across the state as firefighters responded quickly, but the wind fueled those flames and they spread quickly. Thankfully, all across the state, farmers were there to help those firefighters using tractors and discs to help contain the blazes. Residents in many counties were under order to evacuate, all while brave firefighters and farmers put themselves in harm's way to stop the fires. As we wrap up today's show, I wanted to offer my thanks and appreciation to all those who answered the call and remind you that your local fire department can always use more volunteers. Well, that is going to do it for this week's show. If you did miss a story, be sure you're following Market Journal on YouTube and on social media to join in on the conversation. We hope to see you back here next time. Until then, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.